Welcome. Let's begin. Today I'm going to go through the second half of the little book called The Significance of Mary for Women. When we ended it on the last video, we were talking about how Pope John Paul II is putting forth two questions. What concretely does it mean for women today, and what are women especially called to do? And we'll pick it up there. It starts with the role of women in today's world. We live in a world situated between the suspicion of Eve and the trust of Mary. Indeed, it might be plausible to be argued that today we are situated between more closely to the suspicion that to the trust. As already noted, Carl Stern identifies faith or trust as arising out of the mother-child relation, adding that distrust appears as the foil, as it were. To say this is to suggest that trust is the more basic reality, while distrust is simply that which, by contrast, sets it off or enhances it. But, in fact, experience today suggests the opposite. Distrust would appear to be the name of the game. The 1960s gave rise to the notion that no one over 30 could be trusted. Parents and children confronted one another across the generation gap, and children began to see themselves, as the title of one book made quite clear, as the very people against whom their parents has warned them. And while the 60s were happily behind us, their effects live on. We face today, above all, as Max Lerner put it on the episode of Firing Line, first aired several years now ago, a crisis of fragmentation. Distrust is nothing new. Indeed, there is much in this fallen world which must rightly be distrusted. But distrust as a way of life is fatal. Ben Franklin, in his almanac, advised that distrust and caution are the parents of security. Had Mary believed this, she would clearly never have become the mother of God. Our coins assert that in God we trust. I have, however, heard it said that the true intent of that expression was not to affirm the trustworthiness of God, but to deny the trustworthiness of anyone short of God. As one of the buttons in my collection puts it, in God we trust, all others pay cash. Had God accepted this point of view, he would never have entrusted his son to Mary. Today, we are perilously close to that state described by Sartre, in which other people are hell. This is so, said Sartre, because other people always turn us into objects. Today, we are seeing an almost systematic objectification of people. Women and children are objects to be exploited for sexual gratification. Drug addicts, compulsive gamblers, even compulsive shoppers are objects to be exploited for monetary gain. Friends, associates, and colleagues are, in today's kiss and tell books, objects to be exploited for notoriety and fame. Unborn children are treated as products of conception. When we want to be rid of them, and as objects of financial transactions with surrogate mothers when we decide we have a right to them, as though we were like any other product which can be disposed of when unwanted or packaged and marketed when desired. Some women allow their bodies to be exploited for sex without babies, while other women allow their wombs to be exploited for babies without sex. Is it any wonder that trust should be today so rare and precious a commodity? Before becoming Pope, John Paul II conducted a retreat for Paul VI, in which he suggests that the fall of Adam and Eve was simply the first among a series of falls which have carried the human race further and further from God. As he puts it, quote, "Here," he says, in Genesis, we have the beginning, or better still, the origins of the temptation of mankind, the origins of a very long process that winds its devious way through history." End quote. He later adds, quoting him again, "What is said in the 3rd chapter of Genesis seems to lead all the way to the extreme form of denial, the one adopted by present-day man." End quote. If the Pope is right that we are experiencing today the extreme form of denial, and I think he is, it should not surprise us that this extreme denial produces extreme distrust. It may well be, as the Pope suggests, that the seeds of suspicion shown in the heart of Eve have taken this long to come to full blossom. Our crisis of fragmentation is simply the most obvious and logical symptom of this denial. The distrust which has its origin in Eve can only be overcome by the trust which has its origin in Mary. And that means that the battleground on which our faith must be defended today is primarily in the woman's domain, because trust and entrusting are primarily her responsibility. Just as distrust entered the human community by way of the female, so trust must be reinstated by way of the female. Although whole hosts of issues could be discussed under the topic of the role of women in today's world, I would like to restrict myself to what it seems to me are the two most basic and urgent matters which women must immediately address. The first has to do with the trustworthiness of women themselves. The second with the trustworthiness beyond themselves to which women must be able to direct others. With regard to the first, we have seen how God himself entrusted his Son to a woman. And, as we have also noted, God entrusts every child he creates to the care of a woman. This entrusting, however, is a two-edged sword, for it can be exercised either as concern for or control over that child. As Ong has pointed out, such control today, with the express sanction of the law, gives mothers the power to decide arbitrarily whether or not to allow the unborn child to live or have the child killed. More total power over another is unthinkable. Someone has said that every child born into the world is a sign that God has not yet given up on the world. We might also add that it is also a sign that God has not yet given up on mothers. But we must also admit that with each passing day, women offer further evidence that mothers are not to be trusted. First, we had abortion. Then we had surrogate motherhood, and today we face feticide, the deliberate, selective killing now accompanying multiple conceptions. In Familiaris Consortio, or The Role of the Family in the Modern World, the Pope wrote, quote, "Concern for the child, even before birth, from the first moment of conception and then throughout the years of infancy and youth, is the primary and fundamental test of the relationship of one human being to another." End quote. When we consider that the primary entrusting here has to do with the mother in her relationship to the child, we can safely conclude that our society is in deep trouble. The feminist movement has done much to destroy this fundamental relationship, first by suggesting that abortion is a woman's right, and second, by suggesting that motherhood is detrimental to a woman's independence and self-fulfillment. Feminist Jeffner Allen, in an article entitled "Motherhood, the Annihilation of Women," claims that the oppression of women is directly linked to their breeding of children. She concludes, and this is a quote from her, "I am endangered by motherhood. In evacuation from motherhood, I claim my life, body, world as an end in itself." End quote. If ever trust is to be restored in our society, it must begin with women, especially mothers. The battle to end abortion, surrogacy, and feticide must be fought primarily by women, for the entrusting involved in conceiving a child directly involves women, not men. And, perhaps just as important, is the scourge of abortion is ever to be eliminated from the landscape. The strategy to end it must be reformulated. For if the Pope is right, the wrongness of abortion has to do, in the final analysis, not primarily with the fact that no woman has the right to kill her own child, nor even primarily with the fact that unborn children have a right to live, but primarily with the fact that abortion is a violation of trust, indeed of the most basic act of trust, whereby God the Father entrusts to the care and protection of a mother every child he creates. Unless women can be gotten to view this most fundamental of human relationships from that perspective, we shall continue to find ourselves locked in a hopeless struggle over competing rights, with the general public more persuaded by the rights of the party they can see than by the rights of the party they cannot. Women must be trustworthy, but they must also know beyond themselves what can and cannot be trusted, for they have the primary responsibility for bearing adults into the world. Hence, women must be reliable guides for their children, capable of distinguishing between right and wrong, good and bad, the truth of Christ and the lies of the serpent. Every mother is called, with Mary, to direct her children to do whatever Christ asks of them. But this requires that her children be entrusted to a second mother, the church. For it is only by way of the female bride of Christ and mother of us all, which, like Mary, has been entrusted with the task of bearing Christ into the world, that any child's faith can be nurtured by the Eucharistic presence of Christ and the familial support of the ecclesial community. And just as Mary's journey precedes that of the church, but finds its culmination in the church, so every mother's relationship with a child precedes that child's relationship with the church, but finds its culmination in her. In order for that to happen, however, women must first recognize the trustworthiness of the church and entrust themselves to her. Unfortunately, the church herself is under attack today, and that attack is spearheaded even more by women than by men. Once again, the feminist movement has done much to undermine our perceptions of the church as trustworthy. The seeds of suspicion sown in Eden have issued here in a so-called hermeneutics of suspicion. That is a quote from Elizabeth Schulzer Fiorenza, as she characterized it, which allows feminists, in the name of women's liberation, to declare the structures, teachings, traditions, and texts of the church, especially including the Bible, to be products of a patriarchal heresy, which has used the church to oppress women. The inroads this view of things has made in the church are impossible to calculate, but they were exemplified to me very clearly a couple of months ago in a conversation I had with a young man in his last year of seminary training for the priesthood. His theological education in the seminary, he told me, was designed to suggest that the primary role of the priest is not to understand and defend the church's faith, but to engage in insistent questioning of it. Another young man of my acquaintance, also intent on becoming a priest, was recently told by the clinical director of a counseling center at which he underwent the testing necessary to enter the seminary that he really does not have the qualities necessary in a priest today. This young man understands the Catholic faith to be what the church teaches it to be, and that, it turns out, is what casts doubt on the authenticity of his vocation. What he ought to have been doing all along, according to this clinical director, was filtering out those teachings, making independent judgments about them. The message could hardly be clearer. The church is not to be trusted. Indeed, the church is not to be trusted to such a degree that this young man was actually told, in effect, that he ought not only to make his own private judgments about the faith, but also to regard them as more reliable than the ancient, public, and apostolitically grounded witness of the church. If the men, especially the priests and the bishops of the church, have not risen to the church's defense quite as heroically as one might wish, we cannot entirely excuse them, but we can keep in mind the difficult position they are put in when those who attack the integrity of the female church are themselves female. For that very reason, the ultimate defense of the church today is, in my judgment, going to have to come from women. As part of the ministry of entrusting, exemplified by Mary and participated in by all women, the trustworthiness of the motherhood of the church herself has been entrusted to the witness of women. If the men of the church, including her priests and bishops, are to entrust themselves to her, they must have that trustworthiness affirmed, first and foremost, by the women of the church. There is, I think, no more urgent task for women in the church today than this one. For as the Pope had pointed out, the material faith of Mary precedes the male witness of the apostles. Now we come to the conclusion of this little book. We are living through a very difficult time in the life of the church. It is, as Cardinal Ratzinger has pointed out, a confused period where truly every type of heretical aberration seems to be pressing upon the doors of the authentic faith. For that reason, the Cardinal concludes that, quote, if the place occupied by Mary has been essential to the equilibrium of the faith, today it is urgent, as in few other epochs of church history, to rediscover that place, end quote. Mary's central importance lies precisely in the fact that she occupies the heart of the faith. Women also share, or should share, that position with her. When women depart from the center, the entire faith loses its balance, for women supply that equilibrium, to borrow Ratzinger's word, upon which even the hierarchy depends for the effective carrying out of its work. Because women occupy this central position, they have, as Gertrude von Lefort notes, a natural capacity of leaping into the breach. This is a part of vocation or calling of women. But, as Lefort adds, this highest aspect of the woman's vocation is exercised only rarely. Quote, she is called to leap into the breach only in extraordinary, even desperate cases. The highest vocation of woman is always by way of a last expedient, and we grasp the astonishing significance of a St. Catherine or St. Joan only when we know who had already failed on the missions that later became theirs, end quote. This age constituted, I think, one of those extraordinary, perhaps even desperate situations in which women are called to step into the breach of fragmentation created by the seemingly unprecedented distrust which, whether deliberately or not, has the effect of undermining both our society and our church. This crisis, as Max Lerner noted, is not one of access to opportunities, careers, positions of power, but one of nexus, connectedness. Such connectedness cannot be restored by legislation, nor can it be arrived at by reason. Distrust has produced the fragmentation, and only a renewal of trust can repair it. If the Pope is correct in locating and trusting in the mother-child relationship, then a renewal of trust must begin there, and it must be initiated by women. Not only our children, but even the men of our society and our church look to the women for guidance in what can and cannot be trusted. The servants at Cana sought out Mary, not because she could solve their problem, but because they trusted she would know where the solution could be found. Today, our world is looking desperately for solutions to scores of problems. In this situation, what is required are women able confidently to advise, do whatever he tells you, and to point to the church as the place where we learn what it is he asks. Without this maternal, Marian trust and entrusting, there is no possibility at all that the truth of Christ can find a home in the hearts of humanity today. That concludes the reading of the little book called The Significance of Mary for Women. It was put together by Joyce A. Little, a PhD. There are quotes in it from a few other books, and this is an old book. Like I said, this book is from the 1980s. So thank you for listening, and if it taught you anything, then I'm happy. If it hasn't, then we'll go on to something else. So thank you for listening, and you all have a blessed day. Goodbye.